Hey, it's Dr. Asatar Bear here talking to you today about aggregate supply and demand. Aggregate supply and demand. So we're building on our earlier discussion of supply and demand and now trying to build up a model of the whole economy. Let's start with the demand curve. Okay, so what we learned is that on an individual market basis, there is the law of demand, right? That basically says as the price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. So to bring this to a macroeconomic level, let's do this, okay? Let's add up all the demand curves. Add up all demand curves in the economy. All right, so by doing that, we will have the demand for not just one product, t-shirts or iPads or whatever. We'll have the demand for everything, okay? We'll call this aggregate demand. Aggregate just means total, all right? Now, in order to make sense of this, we have to change our variables a little bit because the price is no longer meaningful, right? Like if we say the price of a t-shirt, okay, it's $10. All right, we know we have to give up $10 to get a t-shirt. But if we add up everything, then the price is, what is that, right? This is called the price level. All right, the price level is like the average of all prices. All right, we have issues around how to measure that. We're going to study this shortly, but for now, we'll just say we're going to use a price index to measure that average of all prices. And the most closely watched, most often used one is called the consumer price index. All right, more on that later. So the price level is going to be one of our variables. All right, now when it comes to total quantity, if we're going to try to measure the total quantity of all of these different markets, right, again, we have added up all the demand curves, all right? So we have oranges and we have cars and we have shirts and we have shoes. We have many different kinds of items. We're not going to just measure the total number, right? We're going to reckon the total quantity by doing something like this, saying the price of good one times the quantity of that good plus the price of good two times the quantity of that good, etc. All right, for all of the goods in society, okay, up to however many there are, okay? So if there's n goods in society, price of good n times quantity of good n, and that is going to be what we call our total quantity, okay? We're going to get more into this later because this is in fact how we calculate the total economic product, or as it's called, the gross domestic product. All right, so we're going to use a currency unit. In the United States, we use dollars, of course, to represent this. Okay, so price level, that's price on the macroeconomic level, and then total quantity is in dollars, it is the GDP. And we use a bunch of different synonymous terms to refer to this. So gross domestic product is also total economic income. Okay, total income, total gross domestic product, total quantity, same exact thing. All right, so we're going to make now a supply and demand graph like so. And on the vertical axis, we're going to put the price level. And on the horizontal axis, we're going to put GDP. And that's measured in, let's say, trillions of dollars. All right. So to get the aggregate demand curve, we assume that as the price level increases, that the total aggregate demand falls. All right, so there's an inverse relationship between the aggregate demand, another term that we use to refer to that is simply total spending. All right, so the total spending, aggregate demand, right, as the price level increases, aggregate demand falls, okay? And the reason for this is the income effect. So we, just like with the single product law of demand, we assume that as the price level rises, assuming nothing else changes, people cannot afford the same quantity of goods as they could before. All right, so we'll draw the aggregate demand curve as a downward sloping relationship with a price level, relationship between price level and GDP, and we'll label it AD. All right. Okay, so here we have something that doesn't look all that different, right? We've just changed what's on the axes. Okay, we've got price level, and we've got GDP instead of having P and quantity, right? P and Q. All right, so aggregate demand. Let's see what numbers we would put on here. Okay, let's say that we start off at a price level of 100. Okay, now we don't use units in here because the units aren't really all that meaningful except in terms of their change, right? So what we're gonna, let's say that at a price level of 100, we have a total spending equal to, let's say, $8 trillion. Okay, this is in trillions of dollars down here. All right, so this being a downward sloping relationship implies that if the price level were to go up, let's say to 120, that the total spending would fall to a lower level. Okay, let's say it falls to 6.2 trillion. All right, so what we've produced here is we've got two different points, right? Well, say point A and point B. We can see there's a change in the price level, okay? Now, a change in the price level is this is a very important thing that we're interested in economic theory, right? We're interested in this. We call this either inflation or deflation, depending on the direction of the change, right? An increase in the price level represents inflation. Think about it this way. What used to cost 100 now costs 120. All right, not just for one thing, for everything, okay? That's what we mean by the price level. The prices have risen on average. The price level has gone up. And similarly, if it was to go down, let's say it goes down to 80, that would be deflation, okay? Inflation, an upward movement in the price level. Deflation, downward movement in the price level. All right, and then a change in GDP, change in gross domestic product, this represents economic growth or contraction, okay? So economic growth or contraction, depending on whether it moves up or down. All right, so pretty simple. We've got on one graph then telling us two things that we're very interested in. What is going on with economic growth? What's going on with the price level? So we've defined now aggregate demand. We're calling it AD, representing the total spending in the economy. The next step is, what does the production side look like? Okay, we're going to call that AS, and that stands for aggregate supply. All right, this represents now the total production or the total output, the total amount that is produced in the economy. To understand what is aggregate supply and where does this come from, we need to go back to our assumption about perfectly competitive markets. Okay, so let's consider, okay, if all markets in the economy were perfectly competitive, Well, we've already said what will happen in this situation, okay? All markets are perfectly competitive. What happens is we have a price that prevails, which is called P star, all right? P star and Q star, okay? Remember what P star is. It is that price at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, all right? So again, we have price here, we got quantity down here. We're going to, here's the demand curve, here's the supply curve. Where they meet, that price, which, okay, P star and Q star. All right, now we've made the argument that this P star, this equilibrium price and quantity, is very good for society. All right, it's good for society for several different reasons. Okay, the argument is made to say that this is a stable equilibrium. All right, stable equilibrium. That is, if there's changes in markets, markets adapt to that, right? Like if the price was, say, too high or too low, there would be an adjustment process which would bring the price back to P star, okay? This is what we mean by stable. There is no tendency to change from P star, okay? From that price, that's a stable equilibrium. All right, it's also fair. It's a fair price. The price, P star, represents the true value of that commodity, okay? You have to go more in detail into neoclassical economics to see exactly why that's the case. We're not really going to do that in this course because it's a macro course, but we go into it in much greater detail in Intro to Micro course. All right, so stable, fair, and also the argument here, very important, that this is efficient, okay? And again, this hinges on the argument that at this price, the quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded. And so on a resource level, we are making an efficient use of society's resources, right? Competition, perfect competition, provides incentives to push down the cost of production to as low a level as possible. And this is the argument for efficiency. Okay, so if all markets in the economy are perfectly competitive, we assume, right, what this implies is society is producing the maximum possible level of output. Okay, so this is the argument from classical economics, neoclassical economics, that perfectly competitive markets lead to the maximum output in the society. All right? So if we call this maximum output aggregate supply, okay? Remember, this is how we define it, okay? The total production or the total output. So we could say, okay, society is producing the maximum possible output. It's producing the maximum aggregate supply. Well, what this implies then is that that's regardless of the price level, right? We have a notion now, what is this maximum possible output level? Okay, let's call this, rename this a little bit and call it the potential GDP, all right? So the maximum possible level of output, the potential GDP, meaning if all the stuff I said is true, okay, if all markets are perfectly competitive, if all the resources are being used efficiently, we just advanced an argument for why that's the case, all right? So the potential GDP. So based on this argument, then, we can say, okay, we have perfectly competitive markets. Then aggregate supply is going to appear as a vertical line centered on the potential GDP. Okay, so let's take a look at what does that look like. All right, here's GDP. Here's the price level. And aggregate supply would appear like this. AS. All right. So, and here's our potential GDP. Okay. So let's say that the potential GDP happens to be, again, this is in trillions of dollars. Okay. So let's say that the potential GDP in an economy happens to be $8 trillion. Notice, because it's a vertical line, the position of aggregate demand doesn't actually really matter all that much, right? So the classical or the neoclassical economics, this is what we're talking about, okay? The reason that this is called classical is because it's the economics that goes back to Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and so forth, okay? So classical economics argues that, again, perfectly competitive markets, they push the economy to the maximum level of output, all right? The price level essentially doesn't matter within that argument, okay? So what this graph is saying, look, whenever we have a vertical line or a horizontal line, what we're basically saying is there's no relationship between these two, okay? There's no relationship between the price level and GDP when it comes to supply, all right? Supply is in fact driven by other factors, okay? And the argument goes, it's driven by two things, okay? What are the resources available in society, first of all? And secondly, what is the technology that's available in society? Okay, we get more into this in the micro course, if you're interested. Right, resources and technology. You can see these things are independent of the price level. The price level being higher or lower has no impact on how much resources a society has, all right? When we say resources, by the way, think of things like land, labor, and capital. Okay, so resources and technology drive aggregate supply. All right, now, based on this, what we can see, okay, let's bring these two together, okay? So we've got aggregate supply, and now we're bringing in aggregate demand part, okay? What determines the price level in an economy is the conjunction of these two things, okay? So what is the aggregate supply in this economy? What is the potential GDP? It's $8 trillion. Where aggregate demand meets that, that gives us the price level, okay? Let's say that it happens to cross at 100. What this tells us is that any other price level is not in equilibrium, right? So if the price level was higher, like say 120, well, at 120, society's ability to produce wealth is not changed, right? It's 8 trillion, just as before. But at 120, spending is lower, okay? At a price level of 120, not all that's produced in the society will actually sell, all right? So if there's, let's say, 6.5 trillion at a price level of 120, that's the level of aggregate demand. There's 8 trillion that's produced. A lot of stuff then is not going to sell, right? That stuff goes on sale. When things go on sale, the prices fall all throughout the economy until we get to the equilibrium level, which is 100, all right? So a similar thing would happen if the price level was too low. If it was 80, we can see that this is not an equilibrium. At 80, there's going to be more demanded than there is available. Okay, so the level of demand, let's say, is 10 trillion. There's only $8 trillion worth of stuff. You can't possibly have 8 trillion in sales. People would like to buy that much, but they can't. So the price level goes up until we reach 100. Okay, this is why 100 is the equilibrium price level. And this is part of the overall classical argument that say markets are self-regulating. They don't need outside regulation. They are self-regulating. If the price level is incorrect, either too high or too low, markets will by themselves adjust it to the proper equilibrium price level. All right? And that equilibrium is ideal for society, is optimal for society. It is in fact inconceivable that you could have anything else except for the optimal price level and optimal GDP. Okay, so how then would this change? Let's look at that. Okay, so our next topic, how do we get economic growth? And again, this is in the classical model. All right, so I'm going to redraw aggregate supply and demand curve. We've got GDP, we've got the price level. All right, so our initial position here was that the aggregate supply curve is here, and our aggregate demand curve right here, leading to a price level of 100 and a potential GDP of 8 trillion. All right, so how economic growth would occur is like this, right? Any change in aggregate supply is going to be driven by the two things that cause it, which are resources and technology. Okay, so resources and technology. A change in aggregate supply is caused by either a change in resources or a change in technology. So let's imagine that one of these things has increased, or maybe both of them have increased. Let's say it's an increase in technology. All right, so an increase in technology, what that means is the society can now produce more given its resources than it could before. Okay, so this is going to push the aggregate supply curve to the right. Okay, so we'll get AS1 to AS2. It produces a new potential level. Okay, so the potential level used to be 8, now it's, let's say, 10. All right, so if everything didn't change, we would shift along the aggregate, we would move along the aggregate demand curve. But here's the thing, okay, this increase in technology, which has increased society's ability to produce, right? The very thing that increases society's ability to produce, the same thing as what increases the aggregate supply curve, also increases the income, right? That's what that is. Society is producing more than it was before. That income is then spent. Okay, so the increase in aggregate supply leads to an increase in aggregate demand. All right, normally when we're doing shifts in supply and demand, we don't say that one shift leads to, a shift in demand does not normally lead to a shift in supply. It leads to a movement along the supply curve. A shift in supply does not lead to a shift in demand. It leads to a movement along the demand curve. But when we're talking about the macroeconomy, different rules apply, okay? Because society's, an enhancement in society's ability to produce also raises income, which then raises aggregate demand. And in theory, it should be raised by an amount that is exactly commensurate, okay? So look at this. Going from 8 to 10 involves a change here of 2, okay? In other words, a 25% increase. Okay, so 2, the percent is equal to the change, okay, the new minus the old over the old, right? So 2 over 8, 1 over 4, 25%. So if society is able to produce 25% more wealth, okay, 25%, then it should also have 25% more income, okay? This is the thinking in classical economics. So the shift in the aggregate demand curve that happens should be exactly commensurate, right? It should, okay, AD1 to AD2, it should go through perfectly parallel to the one that came before that, right? The change is exactly commensurate, And notice that the price level is going to be unchanged according to these assumptions, okay? So we end up with stable price level, but we end up with economic growth, because remember, economic growth is the change in GDP, which we can see has gone up by 25%, all right? So this is the explanation for how economic growth works in the classical model, okay? Economic growth, notice, economic growth is driven by changes in the supply side, all right? It's driven by changes in the supply side. And so sometimes this is called supply side economics because it's all about aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is primary. What happens later with aggregate demand is secondary. If aggregate demand did not shift, well, we would simply have a lower price level, but the main thing is we would have a greater amount of social wealth. That's what matters in the classical model, okay? And this idea was summarized by a French economist whose name was Jean-Baptiste Say, okay? And this whole thing that I just described is generally speaking known as Say's law, all right? Say's law. And Say's law has a kind of tagline summary, which is to say supply creates its own demand. Supply creates its own demand, okay? So classical economics describes the macroeconomy as long as we have competitive markets, the macroeconomy is going to be at an equilibrium which is optimal for society. It is efficient. And if there's a change in resources and technology, let's say it's a beneficial change, then we will get economic growth. If resources were to decline, if technology were for some reason to decline, we would get economic contraction, okay? Supply creates its own demand, Say's law. All right, so now here's the problem with all this, right? It's called classical economics because it's the older form of economics, older school of economic thought. So the problem is, how does this relate to what's happening in with the 1929 crash and the Great Depression of the 1930s, okay? So Keynes offers an explanation for this, right? It says, the weakness of the classical theory is that there is no real explanation for what is happening during a recession, right? A recession period where the economy is not producing the maximum output. It's not producing the maximum output, and this is obvious to everybody. It's not producing the maximum output, okay? So the question is, why not, right? We've got two explanations for this, okay? So one explanation would be that the economy is just simply not at equilibrium, right? Because remember, if the price level is too high or too low, then the economy is not going to be at equilibrium. It's not going to be at its optimal equilibrium, particularly if the price level is too high. Aggregate demand will be too low, right? But remember, the classical theory says markets are self-regulating. What is going to happen is the price level is going to fall, and that'll solve the problem, all right? So Keynes says, look, that doesn't happen, okay? There is Keynes' argument, there is market failure in a key market, okay, in the labor market. That market failure in the labor market is due to a very simple thing. Wages don't fall. Wages don't fall because there are labor unions. The labor unions fight decreases in the nominal wage. They resist it. They say, well, if you try and cut our wages, we'll go on strike. So because wages don't fall, Let's redraw our curves here. Price level, and here's GDP. The markets cannot adjust to decreases in aggregate demand. Okay, so Keynes says this. Okay, what happens is, remember, we have this stock market crash in 1929. All right, that crash, for a number of reasons, leads to a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, so if we compare what's going on here, all right, we say, let's look at, there's two aggregate demand curves, okay? The aggregate demand from before the crash, let's say 1929, and then the aggregate demand afterwards, let's say it's in 1930. All right? Before, after, okay? Aggregate demand is shifting to the left, it's decreasing. I talked a little bit about some of the reasons why this happened. You know, the crash in the market has a detrimental effect on psychology. The businesses don't want to invest at the same level as they once did, and so on. Okay, so now we get to, well, what happens out of this? Okay, now Keynes is very aware of the classical model, which says, okay, there is a level of aggregate supply, which is there is a potential level of output. Okay, let's say it's again 8 trillion. Okay, that's the potential GDP. All right. If the price level was able to fall, it could adjust to this without a problem, right? That's the classical story. The price level needs to fall, and then we remain at 8 trillion, no problem. Okay. But Keynes puts a lot more stock in this, right? He says it's obvious what's happening. There's market failure. Markets cannot adjust. Now keep in mind, Keynes is writing this in 1936. It's been several years now. If markets were going to adjust, they would have adjusted, right? They were not able to adjust to this, and they show no signs of being able to adjust. And so the suggestion is, maybe it doesn't make sense to consider the aggregate supply curve to be fully vertical. Maybe it in fact has a horizontal section. Maybe where aggregate demand in 1930 crosses aggregate supply is its equilibrium point, right? And that the level that we're at, okay, society's actual GDP, and remember, it's at equilibrium, could be a lot lower than the potential, okay? Perhaps the actual GDP is 5 GDP, okay? Keynes has made a very different argument, okay? It is possible for the economy to be at equilibrium, and that equilibrium is well below the potential GDP, all right? It's less than potential GDP. So where we're at, the 5 is below where we could be, the 8, okay? So Keynes starts off by acknowledging, yes, okay, the classical economics says the potential GDP is driven by the resources and the technology that society has. But because of market failure, this potential GDP isn't all that relevant, okay, especially during the Great Depression or any recession, really. The potential GDP is not the relevant thing. What's relevant is, where are we actually at? What's the actual GDP? And that could be far below that, all right? What should we do in this situation? Should we try to increase the resources and technology? Should we rely on that markets will self-regulate? No, says Keynes, right? What we need to do in this situation, what to do, is we need to develop policies which increase aggregate demand. All right, so we need policies to increase aggregate demand. A lot of Keynesian economics is all about that, right? It is about government regulation of markets, particularly with the aim of avoiding a great crisis like the Great Depression, okay? And remember, this is premised on the rejection of a central claim, okay? The claim from classical economics is that markets are self-regulating. Keynes says, no, they're not. Markets are not self-regulating. That's why they require government intervention. Are not self-regulating. That's why they require government regulation, because they do not regulate themselves. And we need to develop policies which, when they fail, because they don't do a good job of adjusting downward, all right? So this is that phrase that Keynes uses, markets are downward sticky. They don't adjust the price level well in a downward direction. Adjusting up, that's fine, okay? They don't adjust well downward, all right? So what Keynes ends up arguing is these policies which are designed to increase aggregate demand, let's say that we do that and that's successful, okay? So we go from our aggregate demand in 1930 to we've developed some policies which have increased aggregate demand by 1931. Here's where we are, right? So notice this is going to produce a lot of growth, right? The policies which have increased aggregate demand, now we're moving along a horizontal aggregate supply curve. Let's say we get to, I don't know, 6.5, right? So the growth that's happened relative to where we were, we can see this is pretty significant, right? So a 30% increase in GDP, okay, I'm taking the new minus the old divided by the old, right? Wait, 30%. That has been caused by aggregate demand, okay? So the economy, as long as it is below its potential, okay, below the potential GDP, it's not driven by changes in aggregate supply at all. It's driven by changes in aggregate demand, okay? So Keynes has just upended two central ideas from classical economics, okay? He's upended the idea that markets are self-regulating, arguing no, they're not, and that economic growth is driven by changes in aggregate supply. Keynes says no, it's driven by changes in aggregate demand. This is a revolutionary moment in economic theory, and this is why a new and different economic theory, okay? Not classical theory anymore. The new theory is Keynesian economic theory, okay? Keynesian economic theory has very different pillars than classical theory, right? Classical theory is trust the market, markets are self-regulating, they work great on their own. Keynesian theory says that's not the case. Markets need government regulation, they are not self-regulating. It's possible to have an equilibrium actual GDP that is far below the potential, and that's why we need government regulation. Now, over time, a compromise position was worked between these two positions, okay? Because economists noticed that the classical economics that everyone had learned is very much in contrast and in conflict with the Keynesian economics that is the hot new material, right, that everyone's talking about. And so Keynes, Keynes writes his great work in 1936. He dies only about 9 years later. So Keynes is not himself a big part of the aftermath and the new creation of this new school of economic thought, all right, that bears his name and his legacy. That is mostly done by others, all right? And what others try to do is they try to bring together these disparate ideas into a cohesive whole, right? And because it's a conflict, okay, between these two economic theories, they try to develop a synthesis which brings the both sides to the table, okay? And this ends up being called the neoclassical-Keynesian synthesis. Neoclassical-Keynesian synthesis. It's a pretty cool name there, right? Synthesis means bringing together of things. Okay, the new version of this classical argument, neoclassical Keynesian synthesis. And this is what was done to try to bring both sides to the table. Okay, they said, all right, well, let's start with what we can agree on. Okay, all sides agree the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. Okay, so aggregate demand slopes down. That's not the thing that people are arguing about. Okay, what people are arguing about is what is the shape of the aggregate supply curve. All right, so here's the extent of the disagreement. Okay, the classical theory emphasizes the vertical nature of aggregate supply. Okay, that aggregate supply is vertical and it's centered on a potential level of GDP. All right, at 8. The Keynesians are focused on a flat section of the aggregate demand curve. Right, that's their argument. Okay, so let's just label this. Okay, say here's the classical position up here, and here's the Keynesian position down here. All right. The compromise is to say that in the middle, the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. Okay, so that's the compromise. Aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, and sometimes this was done by bringing in, okay, this compromise AS slopes up as we get closer to the potential level of GDP. We start to get upward sloping. Okay, so the compromise was to say aggregate supply is flat when we're far away from our potential. Okay, in this case 8, right? Aggregate supply is vertical at our potential, okay, at 8. But as we get closer to it, it begins to slope upward. And again, that is the compromise, okay? How is it a compromise, though, okay? Well, in order to see that, we have to do some changes in aggregate demand, okay? So for the classical model, a change in aggregate demand, let's do it like this. Say we go from an initial aggregate demand position here to a new one here, okay? For the classical view is that changes in aggregate demand don't matter at all, okay? Changes in aggregate demand cannot cause economic growth because all we're doing is shifting along a vertical. We're always at 8, whether aggregate demand is here or here, wherever it is. As long as the classical assumptions are met, aggregate demand essentially does not matter, right? For the Keynesians, it's exactly reversed. The Keynesian view is that aggregate demand is everything, right? Shifts in aggregate demand, okay, going from AD1 to AD2 in the Keynesian view, that does everything, right? Does that cause economic growth? Absolutely it does, because we move from a position where, let's say, we're at 3 to a much better position, right? That is economic growth. So the Keynesian view is changes in economic growth. That is what causes they lead to economic growth or contraction if it's a decrease in aggregate demand, all right? So what makes the middle a compromise is it gives both sides something, right? So if we're in the middle in this upward sloping region, changes in compromise, right? Changes in aggregate demand have 2 effects, okay? So they lead to changes in GDP, that is the nod to the Keynesians, okay? The classical theory emphasized any change in aggregate demand is going to have only one effect, which is a change in the price level, okay? It's not going to cause economic growth, it's only going to cause, in this case, inflation, all right? Keynesians were the opposite. It's only going to cause economic growth, no inflation. The compromise is to say changes in aggregate demand lead to both. They lead to changes in GDP and they lead to changes in the price level, inflation or deflation. All right? And so the shape of the aggregate supply curve says a lot about what we're dealing with, okay? Are we talking about an orthodox Keynesian position in which the aggregate supply curve is flat? Are we talking about an orthodox classical position? Or are we talking about most economists by now have entered this kind of compromise period, okay? And a lot of times the way it's described is in terms of like long run and short run, okay? So sometimes you'll see something like this. In the long run, the aggregate supply curve is vertical, just like the classicals predicted. But in the short run, it's upward sloping, okay? So sometimes you'll see the SRAS versus the LRAS. I think that's kind of confusing because, they have like two different curves on the same thing, right? To me, it makes a little bit more sense to think about it in terms of this historical compromise. All right, so that's my lecture on aggregate supply and demand. We can use this to understand changes in economic growth and the price level.